Welcome back. All right, so there's a narrative that's in the hockey world that I've talked about before and said it kind of irritates me a little bit. I get where it's coming from. And it's the narrative that, well, the Pacific Division sucks. And you hear that a lot, right? Well, yeah, the Flames won the Pacific, but it's the Pacific. Division's not very good. The funny thing to me is that then if I make a statement like, hey, I think the Canucks have a shot at a playoff spot this year, those same people will say, they're not making the playoffs. There's no chance. If the division sucks, why can't they? If your argument is they're not good enough to make the playoffs, the division can't suck. That's that to me is how I look at it, right? So you've got Calgary, Edmonton, LA, Vegas, Vancouver, San Jose, Anaheim, Seattle. They all finished in that order last year. So just a quick look at these teams. Calgary, it could have been a disastrous offseason. I think they arguably are at least as good as they were last year. If the chemistry works out fine with the new guys, they could be better. If they struggle with the chemistry, they could have a little bit of a fallback. Then you've got Edmonton, who have two of the best centers in the National Hockey League. Though Draisaitl does play wing on a regular occasion, they're still two of the best in the game, regardless of where they are on the ice. And they've built a pretty good team around them. And there's good reason to think Edmonton could be the winner of that division this year. You've got the LA Kings, young up and coming team, who may be a player or two away from really serious contention. Now, whether that comes from within and is one of the kids growing through this organization, whether it's, a trade made via wherever, right? Likely in the East, where you'd be looking to bring somebody in and trade something out. But the Kings aren't that far off. Then you have Vegas, who, of course, had tons of injuries last year, injuries to key players as well. And that very likely cost them a playoff spot overall, right? So Vegas should bounce back this year and should be better. Then you got Vancouver, who after the coaching change got a heck of a lot better under Bruce Boudreau. There's good reason for optimism in Vancouver. That's 5 out of 8 teams that you can make an argument in the Pacific could maybe make the playoffs. Then you got San Jose, and they're betting on a bounce back year this year. They're hoping for a bounce back year this year. We'll see how it goes. Anaheim should be better. Seattle absolutely should be better this year as well. But let's look at last year's numbers, because the argument again is this division sucks. So the Calgary Flames against the Atlantic Division had a record of 8-5-3. Against the Metro, they were 12-2-2. Honestly, the Metro Division was the one they had the easiest time with. Against the Central, they were 14-6-4, and against the Pacific, they were 16-8-2. So the Atlantic, the division they had the hardest time with. The Metro, probably the one they had the easiest time with. Against the East, they were 27-5, and against the West, they were 30-14-6. So by regular season numbers, this wasn't an easy 2 points for Atlantic Division teams or Metro Division teams when they came in. Then there's the Oilers. They struggled against the Atlantic. They were 6-9-1, but against the Metro, they were 9-5-2. So there's 2 teams in a row that have a decent record against the Metro. In the case of the Flames, it's excellent, and again for the Oilers, it's pretty good. Against the Central, they were 13-8-3. They really made hay in their own division. They were 21-5 against the Pacific. So Pacific Division teams did not do well against the Oilers. Against the East, the Oilers were 15-14-3. Against the West, they were 34-13-3. So the Oilers are an example. If you want to say this is what we see against the East, they were they only won 15 out of 32 games. Against the West, they win 34 out of 50. So this is an example of how the West is easier than the East to play against. But then you get into the LA Kings, who really enjoyed playing against the East. They were 12-3-1 against the Atlantic, and they were 11-3-2 against the Metro. Loved playing against the Eastern-based teams. Against the Central, they were 9-11-4, and against the Pacific, they were 12-10-4. So LA's problem was in the West. Against the East, they were 23-6-3, and against the West, they were 21-21-8. In the event that people are right, this division's terrible, the LA Kings should not have only had 6 regulation losses against Eastern-based teams out of 32 games. Absolutely not. This is the 3rd place team in the Pacific. This isn't the best team in the Pacific. So there's that. Then you get into the Vegas Golden Knights. They were 9-6-1 against the Atlantic. They struggled against the Metro. They were 7-8-1. Against the Central, they were 11-10-3. So not a spectacular record against the Central, but within their own division, they were excellent, 16-7-3. So their best record is against the Pacific Division. Against the East, they were 16-14-2. Against the West, 27-17-6. So better against the West than against the East, absolutely. Vancouver, they've had their struggles against the East. Yeah. 6-7-3 against the Atlantic, 8-7-1 against the Metro. I've talked about this for what, 3-4 years now, where that Eastern swing often kills their chances at a playoff spot. And they have that Eastern swing early this year. They start their year on the road. It's a really good test for this Canucks team to see if they really truly are better and they've learned from past mistakes or not. The East Coast swing is going to be very telling. They were 13-10-1 against the Central, 13-6-7 against the Pacific. Against the East, 14-14-4 against the West, 26-16-8. Their overall record not fantastic, but again, expectations are they should be better this year. I do believe in some of those Eastern losses, those would be under Travis Green, but they still count. They're still in there. I'm not taking them out, and I'm not going to, get into that part of the analysis. San Jose is an interesting case as well. They did better against the East than they did against the West. So if your expectation was, well, as he gets down through these teams, obviously the bad teams are going to be really struggling against the East. Not necessarily. San Jose was 7-6-3 against the Atlantic, 8-6-2 against the Metro. Against the Central, they were 8-13-3 against the Pacific, 9-12-5. Now, this is where the argument comes in of, well, yeah, but San Jose, they were underrated. The team took it easy on them. But that wouldn't explain why they struggled against the Western-based teams when they were already out of the playoff picture. Against the East, they were 15-14-5 against the West, 17-25-8. So definitely better against the East. Anaheim, better against the East as well. 9-2-5 against the Atlantic, 6-7-3 against the Metro Division. So worse against the Metro than they were against the Atlantic. So the Oilers would want to talk to them about how you beat those teams in the Atlantic. And then in the West, against the Central Wasteland, 5-16-3, 11-12-3 in their own division. So against the East, 15-9-8. Against the West, 16-28-6. So for Anaheim, definitely more trouble against the West. And then Seattle liked playing against the Atlantic Division. It's the only division they had a 500 record against, 8-5-3. So whether you go by the NHL 500, or the 3 games above, or actual 500, which would be 8-8. They were there. Against the Metropolitan Division, 5-8-3. Against the Central, 8-16. And in their own division, 6-20. They won 6 out of 26 games in their own division. They won 8 out of 16 against the Atlantic. They had the same record against the Atlantic as Calgary did. It's one of those oddities. But again, you look at the bottom 3 teams in the Pacific, where this should be the teams that get eaten for lunch by the teams in the East, and they weren't. They really weren't. So to me, the Pacific Division, is it the strongest? I'm not arguing that. My argument is simple, that it's not as bad of a division as I think a lot of people make it out to be. Where, let's say San Jose, Mike Greer comes forward and goes, I think we have a shot at the playoffs. And somebody will say, well, it's the Pacific. It's pretty easy to make the playoffs in the Pacific. So, yeah, they should be able to do that. For San Jose, they were 9-12-5 against the Pacific. They have to turn that around. And for San Jose, and especially for Seattle, if Seattle can improve their play within the division, they immediately are a much better team. Because against the Central and the Pacific, that's where they had their problems. And since that's where the lion's share of your games are, if you're Seattle, that's a problem. You're 13-13-6 against the East, and 14-36-0 against the West. Not even an overtime or shootout loss point against the West. They lost all those in regulation. So this is the argument from the Central side of things. So let's look at the best teams in the league, right? So we'll look at the best teams in the league and their record against the Pacific Division. Because if the Pacific Division is bad, that'll show there. For the Florida Panthers, who won the President's Trophy, they were 12-2-2 against the Central, 9-6-1 against the Pacific. So they won fewer games against the Pacific than they did against the Central Division. We can all agree that the Central Division is a pretty good division, right? You've got the Stanley Cup champions with Colorado, the 2019 Cup champions in St. Louis, a Minnesota team led by Kaprizov that just had its best year, arguably ever, and it's a pretty good division. Yet Florida had a better record against them than they did against the Pacific. Then we have Colorado. To measure them, I measured their record against the East against their record against the Pacific. Against the East, they were 22-8-2. Against the Pacific, 19-4-1. As a Canuck fan, I remember. Carolina, against the Central, they were 11-4-1. Against the Pacific, 13-2-1. So again, if you want to simplify that and take the overtime and shootout losses and just turn them into losses, that's 11-5 against the Central and 13-3 against the Pacific. I really do like hockey with a win and loss column, and that's it. But that's me. That's me. I've talked about bringing back ties and how, if they did, I wouldn't really complain that much. But to me, a record of win, loss, that's it. You see it in most other sports in North America. I'd love to see it. It's never going to happen. So I'll stop dreaming and keep going. On the Carolina front, they were 11-4-1, 13-2-1, and then you get to Toronto. Toronto was 9-4-3 against the Central, 11-5 against the Pacific. So they definitely did well against the Pacific in comparison with the Central, but they were 5 games above NHL 500 on one, 6 games above NHL 500 on the other. Close. Then there's Minnesota against the East. They had a good record against the East, 23-5-4 against the Pacific, 17-7. So again, we want to simplify it, 23-9 versus 17-7. Very similar record there. Then there's the New York Rangers against the Central. They were 9-6-1 against the Pacific, 8-5-3. The Rangers, a better points percentage is to be had between neither. But if you look at wins, they had one more win against the Central than they had against the Pacific. 9-7, 8-8 if you want to simplify those records. Tampa Bay, 10-4-2 against the Central, 12-3-1 against the Pacific. They were better against the Pacific than the Central, but again, it's close. And that's the thing. If the chasm between this division and all the others was as wide as people think it is, this is really where it should show up, where you're talking about the teams with the best records in the league. And I've organized them from number 1 through to number 12 in the league, keeping, of course, the Pacific teams out because I've already talked about them. Then you have St. Louis, 15-12-5 against the East. They did very well against the Pacific, 17-4-3. Boston, 11-4-1 against the Central, 9-5-2 against the Pacific. More struggles against the Pacific than against the Central. Pittsburgh, 9-4-3 against the Central, 9-5-2 against the Pacific. Almost the exact same record. And then Washington. Washington, 9-4-3 against the Central, 6-6-4 against the Pacific. So they won 6 out of 16 games against the Pacific Division. So I know the argument's still going to be there. I know that it is still going to be a matter of, and I sometimes I think it's the fact there's 3 Canadian teams there, so immediately people look and go, well, Canadian teams don't win Stanley Cups. Canadian teams aren't good in the playoffs, so whatever. And then, of course, the Oilers being swept in the conference final by Colorado definitely made a difference, too, in that it made it look even more apparent, like, oh, well, clearly the Pacific is a trouble. I think the team that would have given this team the most trouble, would have given the Avalanche the most trouble from the Pacific, probably would have been the Kings. I just think the style of hockey played by the Kings would have given the most trouble. They still would have lost against Colorado, but I think they at least would have got a game or two. I'm not sure with Calgary. Calgary maybe, but again, Edmonton got to that point. It was a learning experience for them, as losing often is. Learning experiences are never fun. You never see a kid coming off of a great roller coaster ride, all excited, and somebody going, that was a learning experience. Yeah, it's not the way learning experiences work. But it's easy to dismiss the division, but I'm not in that position. And watching as much hockey as I do, I think the Pacific Division's good. I'm not saying it's great. I'm not saying it is the equivalent to, say, the Atlantic. The Atlantic, I think, is stacked. But again, Calgary, Edmonton, LA all look strong. Vegas should bounce back. And I think Vancouver has a good chance of being quite good this year as well. And so you have 5 teams, again, that you could argue could be in this year's playoffs. And at least 4 of them should make the playoffs. Maybe it is going to be 4-4 between the Pacific as well as the Central. We were close to that. Vegas just finishing below that line, below Dallas. Otherwise, we would have had 4-4 this past spring. But there you go. Let me know your thoughts in the comments section below, as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe. If you're browsing your way through, you just happen upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.